Hi, welcome back to my channel. I was going to do a quick video on, well I say quick, hopefully quick, but not massively. I don't know why I like try and speed myself up. I think the idea is to like enjoy the video, make it enjoyable for you, and not to be like, hey I'm going to do a quick video on this, but I just find a lot of my videos like educational, and something, again, very apt for me to say in a video that is related to the education system. I literally swear I don't like make these little anecdotes up before I start speaking, you just kind of cut out. But I'm doing like a little video about the education system, like what like we learn in the education system, like that is not necessarily helpful as adults. Some things that are questionable and some things that are fine and some things that like it's just good to evolve as an adult. So I'm not like trying to like completely say that the education system is just not good at all. But I do think that like there are things about it that can be developed from my perspective, but also things that you will inevitably or possibly pick up from school that bringing into the rest of the world were either not healthy, understandably unhealthy because of the situation, as I put it in this video. You recognise why you're thinking that way and you're not like come from planet whatever and you're not abnormal in that situation. So just to go straight into it, because I've just thought of another thing. So you could even start off by, actually no, I'm going to start off by this, saying school does not teach self-care, for example. We have very little PSHE subjects, and it's often based around like, you know, obviously academic subjects. You could argue PSHE and involvement in health, it's good to not get kids overly focused on health, and like education is good, but kids often have the tendency, you know, you want to keep them as naive as you can, and like, you know, over education on, you know, illness etc. might not be the healthiest thing, understandably. But the fact that we have a lot of homework and things at home, like basically just is not good for like the mental states of people that find school in younger years neurologically difficult to deal with because of all the different subjects. It's not the case for everyone, I'm aware of that, but like having a difficult time at school, I mean school, like you're giving a 9 to 3 day to school every day. Understandably it gets you into a place for work, but really the education system, you have to give that time legally, and giving extra stuff at home just can like make way for just unhealthy, you know, overwork of people. And not only that, just this lack of rest culture which has just built up more and more over time. So yes, and yes, I understand that school is a good place obviously to make people adhere to each other, not adhere even is a wrong word, but make people be able to live in a functional society where we don't actually stab each other. Like, not to say that anyone, okay, well that sounds like I'm really unhealthy, and obviously I understand that, but obviously everyone makes other people angry regardless of, you know, you're always going to get egged off by someone. If we weren't in school, you know, could we go back to our primal core self and want to, you know, inflict serious harm upon some people? Probably most people would feel that way eventually, even if you don't swing that way neurologically. So there we go. But equally it does give us grounding in society and a basic idea what you want to not do, what you want to do, and gives perspective and obviously education on the subjects you're learning as well. But I think it's often about socialising, but that can be dysfunctional in ways that I'm going to be talking about. Sorry, brain rest. So I guess like socially then, it makes people, it can lean for some people a way to feel abnormal if they don't fit to the status, to the ideology. It can also bring around ideology as well. If someone is quite a literal person and they perceive a certain ideology of a certain person or way to be that they notice that they do not conform to, that can make someone feel less than, basically, and then vulnerable to like things that might not be good for them. Obviously, vulnerability in human beings is obviously inherent, and being vulnerable can help you make friends, and not being vulnerable, but like, you know, you might be attracted to certain people's vulnerabilities, understandably, but it can also make way for poor self-esteem and like just things that aren't necessarily healthy, especially if carried into adulthood, and maybe just like poor habits, victim mentality. If you don't want to be at school, you can adopt a victim mentality. Obviously, a lot of people might, you know, end up growing from that and thinking, I don't want to be in a victim mentality, but obviously you can fall into that victim mentality, especially if you feel that you're being hard done to, not being there and having to be there, because like teenagers are like naive, but it gives you obviously discernment against things like that. So all of these things that happen, like, teenagers really just have to endure it. Obviously you haven't got anything to like compare to as a teenager, apart from obviously like primary school, but obviously you learn more and more throughout life. So also in terms of talking back to teachers and things like that, you know, it can be said that like if you talk back to a teacher, it can be seen back like as rude, and like if everyone is like told that talking back is rude and like changing systemic issues is rude, like that's really not going to be very good, like going out into the world and like actually living like life and trying to change the planet and the world from things that are actually wrong, because, you know, people, for example, they're expelled or unwilling to be putting like, are basically unwilling to put a social construction in the way of their own needs. And obviously this isn't always like the case. I mean, it is the case, but it obviously can also be linked to people that have like autism, ADHD, mental health problems, etc. But obviously that is seen as like an undesirable way to be, which then could potentially have like implications of like trying to not get help for like mental health. Because I've noticed a lot of people, even if they're not obviously expelled or they have such a bad time that they have to leave school because of like, you know, being unable to, as teachers would say, unable to cope in school, but really they're actually respecting and honouring their own needs, because so they basically are taught not to honour your own needs, and that worth is external and not internal. So honouring your own worth would be an internal reward and like an internal intrinsic value that we all have, whereas school really teaches you to look only for external validation, and that if you don't do that, you're basically not worth anything, whereas we all have intrinsic value. And then basically, yeah, we kind of like need to know this in order to like develop in the world and, you know, like develop different things in the world, etc. And obviously we all have like a grade system, so like we're aware of like meritocracy from that level, and for some people it can, I wouldn't say an obsession, but obviously it can be an obsession. For people that are perfectionists, hard workers, the grade system can just basically be in the back of your mind a lot of the time, like a goal that you're sort of striving towards. And I've done a video just recently about how we can strive towards goals that are not in our actual are not aligned with ours, you know, not a goal we're actually aligned with, but because we're socialized in that way, we can become aligned with it. So the next thing I'll talk about is lack of social guidance. You don't get a phone, you don't get books, you don't get anything sort of apart from, you know, like the stuff that you're supposed to do in school, basically. And we know, and I've spoken about in another video, that your ego, if it feels inadequate, will basically become controlling, become an overachiever, or become, what's the other one? Controlling, an overachiever, people pleaser. So basically, if you're in school and you haven't got the ability to basically creatively create an environment for yourself that helps you healthily vent those needs, you can obviously, as a school, you like in a workplace this can happen, but often more in school, you become like a gossip, become obsessed with potentially social hierarchy, or to gain like control, or be a people pleaser, or create like a fantasy situation, you know, to create like being an overachiever, because really you have a lot of limitations in school, and like that's not something that it's easy to change, like because you have, you know, at the end of the day 4 rules that you're stuck in between 9 and 3, and there's not a lot you can do to really change that. So often people turn to like fantasies and things that really are not helpful for the mental health, the physical health or anything like that, but really just to cope. The next point I'm going to go on to is so yeah, and also you can actually invent people in your mind to like prank into thinking that you fancy them, for me, which sounds like a really mean thing to do, and it's like not something I would do now necessarily, but something I did, and like a lot of we used to like prank text people because we've sat on the bus for 3 hours, and looking back that was probably like really insensitive to a young boy's feelings, but it was just like out of boredom, like being on a bus for 3 whole hours. So yeah, like just I've noticed since being in a mental health service that building community and basically being more in touch with my morality has been really helpful, but in school, like building community is not something that's strived for, I've noticed, and just it's okay, that's a lie. I've been to a community-based school in later years as an adult. Maybe in later years, school the community basis is built on a bit more. It depends what school you go to. I feel like I think if you go to a higher level school, there can be a lot of toxicity, and that does not. Let's say it completely is the opposite to building a community structure. I'll tell you that. I've experienced that firsthand. And weirdly enough, the lower end schools often tend to be a lot more community based and like less toxic. So there we go. Obviously, looking back to older years, hitting and being put in a dunce hat has been something that is done to adults for not adhering to certain processes. And you've got to think, does this make way for sociopathic teachers, sociopathic children who basically do not have the capacity to manipulate, so basically gain power by violence or fear? So you've got to think about that. That's called low-level sociopathy. High-level sociopathy is where you manipulate. But then you've got to think that shame that's then put on the children. I hope you're still with me. My brain's starting to hurt. No, I'm joking. But like, I probably should slow down a little bit because I'm starting to chatter. But then you think a whole generation looking at school as a place where there's lots of sociopathic teachers that, you know, will hurt you if you don't do as they say, which is kind of the rules. It's kind of my teacher says this. Obviously you get teachers that don't do that, obviously, and more so I feel like you get teachers that are better, I've noticed, in older years, and also, but like even myself, I know at school obviously it's harder to, you've got to think older years, the kids want to be there, it's voluntary, you don't have to be there, whereas in younger years often you have to just put up with the teacher says, because obviously the teachers, it's a harder job because you get a lot more difficult children that don't want to be there and they have to be there, so they're obviously creating more disruption, understandably. But even me, like, I look down on someone that's creating disruption where really they're creatively looking for an outlet for their own ego and their own mental well-being, so I'm really like not someone that's going to start attacking them from now. But so yeah, obviously not all teachers are sociopaths, of course not, but it can make way for believing that schools like validate that or whatever. So anyway, obviously that happens in work and life and everything. Obviously, yeah, so it basically can invalidate sensitive people because obviously there's this sort of one size fits all kind of idea that, you know, if you don't adhere to this way of life, if you have particular sensitivities towards other people or certain ways of being, it can be difficult to actually, you know, be what you want to be if you're not being validated for those things. So So obviously in the Bible, I'll just do a couple of Bible quotes. I do like putting a Bible quote in there because just to give some perspective, God says that he'll give you certain work and you'll be rewarded for that work. But it can also give this idea, at least for me, because I went to a Catholic school, there was a lot of wires that were crossed when I went into my Catholic upbringing, went to church a lot of the time, that I couldn't tell the difference between what was God and what was a teacher, what was a toxic situation, because I know now that God is a heavenly loving father that really cares for us and does not want to manipulate us, does not want to, I mean, like, God works in mysterious ways, but like, God is like not got the level of a manipulative teacher, for example, has not got the level of a manipulative person. But it's easy when people have a God complex to comply to other people's God complexes and think that God has those levels where really he doesn't. And it's just like, it's easy to feel like you have to be forced to comply to a teacher's unfair demands if they are a sociopath, for example. And, you know, it's easy, obviously, for kids to like navigate that situation because people are quite intelligent and intuitive, and you know, they can deal with things in a lot of creative ways often, but it is a culture really that people, not a culture, but it can be difficult if children feel like they haven't got that sort of safety of, they don't have to comply to certain sociopathic tendencies that teachers have, obviously in a way of, you know, perceived authority, which obviously they do have in school, but then as you go into life, it's easy to perceive other people that have those traits that you might have seen an authority member to have authority over you where really they don't. Interestingly enough, I've mentioned in a past thing that although I wouldn't call myself this, I do feel that I can exhibit psychopathic traits, and I watched a whole video on someone that had like psychopathic diagnosis of psychopathy, sorry. Took me a while to get that out. I'm not saying like that this is necessarily a good thing, but sometimes it helps me feel that I'm able to protect myself in certain situations because I can go into that mode. Like, if you wind me up to that extent, I am going to go fucking hell for leather on you, sorry. And I don't want to deny that situation because I'm quite happy I've got it, and I'm quite happy to exhibit that when needed. So anyway, I was watching a whole video on this woman that was actually diagnosed as a whole-blown psychopath that really affected her life, and she had to have therapy to you know, deal with some of the situations from it. And she said how one thing that can trigger her is when people do have this authority complex and they feel that they have authority to make demands upon her that really they don't, and that's something that can make her actually get really, really angry and just really just let out on them. So there we go. Maybe I have that too, we never know. So basically, yes, of course school's going to be the epitome of meritocracy and sort of achievement, which I always think it does encourage this goal culture. Whether we're too obsessed with goal culture and achieving goals and self-improvement, I don't know, because obviously we are in a new astrological era, life has changed dramatically. I watched an Elevation Church video which referred to old devils, new levels, and basically, you know, it's tricky to kind of decipher whether that meritocracy, obviously schools have got more difficult to deal with, there's more challenging stuff going on in schools for children, obviously it's more stressful, but life's more stressful, so there we go. Also, copying a teacher and their ways may not align. You might adopt certain things from a teacher, such as working in a certain way. You've got to think, as a child, especially if you're not very good at perceiving a whole other person's life, if you've grown up with social media like I did, it's difficult sometimes, and I think back to self-esteem issues that I'd had, or, you know, I wasn't big on comparison, to be fair, because I've always been raised to be very proud of myself and not to focus on others, which is a great thing, but I do think that basically being in a place where you're often obviously surrounded by lots of different people, you're taught by teachers that have certain traits that you may adopt for yourself without even realising it or thinking that's the way you should do it. So you might obviously, you know, pick up a trait from a teacher, I have to work hard on this, where really you're not actually that interested in it and it wouldn't kill you not to do it. So it's sometimes for me going to be about like evaluating. So I think that's why I've actually immersed myself so much into learning, and I do think learning is a great thing, to be fair, and I wouldn't knock it. Obviously I have had mental health issues from working myself too hard. So yeah, school often discourages self-expression, and often because obviously people can like be bullied, etc., and you can have peers can not be very well controlled within a school environment at times. You can be discouraged from intuitive eating, obviously, because you're like given certain time frames when you can and can't eat. You're encouraged to conform. The Bible says, "Do not conform to the ways of the world, but be transformed by," I think, I'm not transformed by something, but I think obviously transformed by God, in the way like God gives you things in the world to learn and etc. But it says, "Do not conform to the ways of the world, but be transformed by God," for example. Onto school uniform, something that we haven't really touched on, which is where they often wear see-through shirts for the girls. Do the boys? I think they all wear see-through shirts. What is this about? You remember that girl in school that used to wear a bright pink bra? What the fuck was that about? Obviously some strange thinking going on there. Why would you wear see-through shirts? You might be like, oh, it's just the material. Yes, it might just be, but you could still see bras through it, however which way you want to look at it. Obviously it encourages conformity, lack of self-expression again. You often had to buy them for very pricey school shops. That there was no other way to get the school uniform than to go to these shops. School in general encourages sitting down all day, which basically is setting you up for an office job, and really just isn't there for anything else, really. So in terms of social adhering, it can encourage sort of like really unhealthy toxic patterns, such as hating others, codependency, bullying. And the fact is, you can't choose your genes. You cannot choose the genes you were born with, and people react differently to different things. People have different ways of expressing their ego. People have different ways of reacting to things that they don't agree with. Sometimes people will kind of go along with that and try and sort of, just that's their way of getting over it. Some people completely try and distance themselves because they can't comprehend. People are so different and we all have such different ways of thinking. But I do think that these things can be seemingly encouraged. Things like bullying, even though they're not encouraged actively by the teachers, we all know we have a lack of funding. Like, you can only do so much within school, and I know God is like looking over us, and obviously to an extent God will take control from situations like that. But it's easy to validate things like bullying and perceive that teachers and other people validate things like bullying when really they're not, and they're just not doing anything about it because it's not their place. But there we go, we're all different, but I do think that some people, again, genes-wise, they can have a huge disposition to narcissism, they can have a huge disposition to psychopathy, they can have a disposition to sociopathy, they can have a disposition to, like, in way of narcissism, classism, racism. They can obviously be born of a different race, born of a different religion, born into a different religion, should I say. They could have mental health issues, they could have self-harm scars, which the school uniforms might not necessarily make way for certain religious faiths and stuff. Gender, you're obviously split into different genders very specifically. You're either a boy or a girl, and if you're having issues around your gender, that can be quite difficult, especially if you're, you have to dress that way. And there's just no self-expression in school uniform at all. So basically, yeah, there's biases from teachers, different people. Of course, we all have our own way of socialising, we all have our friendship groups, but in terms of elitism and taylorising different people is good, and I feel like it can make way for people that aren't chosen as the elite to release bitterness